My alarm went off at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. 13 minutes before the world expected me to function. 13 minutes before I had to pretend that I had my life together. I lay in the darkness listening to the radiator in the corner make its familiar clanking sounds. That old heating system had been struggling for 3 winters now. 3 long winters of uncertainty. 3 winters of hoping it wouldn't completely give out before I scraped together enough money to replace it. It produced heat in fits and starts. Never reliable. Never quite broken enough to justify calling someone to fix it. I couldn't afford to call someone. I couldn't afford much of anything anymore. Outside my window, the city was mostly asleep. Queens Boulevard was quiet except for delivery trucks starting their routes. The kind of trucks that belonged to people who had stable jobs, who had health insurance, who didn't have to worry about whether they could afford to keep their daughter warm at night. November had turned bitter. The kind of cold that makes you question every decision that led you here. Every choice that resulted in this apartment, in this neighborhood, in this life. I bumped up the thermostat to 68 degrees even though I knew it would cost an extra $40 this month. Money I didn't have. Money that would have to come from somewhere else. Money that would mean cutting something else out. But I couldn't let Sophie wake up cold. I couldn't do that to her. Sophie was 8 years old. 8 years of being her father. 8 years of trying my best. 8 years of still feeling like I wasn't doing enough. Old enough to notice things. Old enough to understand when there wasn't enough money. Old enough to see the weight in my shoulders when bills came in the mail. Old enough to recognize the particular kind of stress that came with being a single parent in a city that was designed for people with more money than I would ever have. I'd watched her learn to want less. Watched her at birthday parties, celebrating other kids' abundance without mentioning what she wanted for herself. Watched her understand at some deep level that her needs could deplete my ability to survive. That her wanting something meant I would have to figure out how to pay for something else less. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a single father. Your kid starts making themselves smaller. They learn that their dreams take up space that could be used for rent. That their wishes cost money that could go toward electricity. That wanting things is a luxury that belongs to other families, not to families like ours. I dragged myself out of bed and moved through the apartment with practiced silence. Every movement deliberate, every step careful. I'd learned years ago how to move through darkness. My work boots were by the door, still caked with dirt from yesterday's service call in Manhattan. Boots like these last forever if you take care of them. I'd bought them 15 years ago and they were still holding up. Better than my life was holding up. Better than my chances were holding up. I moved carefully in my socks first, feeling the cold linoleum floor beneath my feet. Cold enough to make me wince. Cold enough to remind me that I needed to check the thermostat before I left. The apartment was old. Everything in here was old and tired. Walls that had been painted and repainted so many times that the paint was starting to crack. Floors that creaked when you walked on them. A ceiling in the kitchen that had water damage from a leak I could never quite afford to get fixed properly. It wasn't home in the way that word usually meant something warm and safe and permanent. It was survival. It was a place where my daughter slept and went to school and did her homework. It was shelter. And that was all I could give her. My van was parked 3 stories below on the street. I could see it from certain angles. A 2009 Chevy, 15 years old and increasingly unreliable. The kind of vehicle that had seen better days and was now rapidly approaching the point where it would see no days at all. It burned oil like water. I'd filled the reservoir 3 times in the past month alone. $50 I didn't have. The air conditioning stopped working 3 summers ago, and I'd learned to live with it. You roll down the windows in the summer and accept the heat as the price of keeping the cooling system from breaking further. You make compromises. You accept that you can't have everything. The transmission made a sound like grinding glass when I shifted into reverse. A sound that made me wince every time I had to back up. Which I tried to avoid doing whenever possible because the sound made me remember how fragile everything was, how one wrong move could make the whole thing collapse. But the van ran. It still ran, and that was all I needed. I showered in water that took forever to warm up. I stood under the spray and waited. And waited. By the time it got hot enough to feel like something other than torture, I only had 8 minutes left before I needed to get ready for my first job of the day. 8 minutes to get clean and dressed and out the door. 8 minutes was all I ever got. I dried myself with a towel that was more holes than fabric, something I bought 4 years ago at a discount store. Something that had somehow survived this long through sheer force of will and my refusal to throw anything away. Every possession had value, even things that were falling apart. I pulled on my work uniform. The HVAC technician polo was faded but clean. Navy blue worn to almost grey in certain places where the sun had bleached it or where my shoulders had worn through it with repeated motion. The same shirt I'd worn to work almost every day for the past 8 years. My work pants had oil stains that wouldn't come out anymore. Stains from jobs I'd done. Stains from helping other people stay comfortable. Stains that had become permanent parts of the fabric. I'd stopped trying to get them out 6 months ago. At a certain point, you accept that some things are permanent. You accept that you carry the work with you whether you want to or not. These clothes were my identity now. They announced to the world that I worked with my hands, that I fixed things, that my labor made other people's lives comfortable while my own slowly fell apart. Before I left for work, I went to Sophie's room and stood in the doorway. I did this every morning. It was a ritual. A moment of stillness before the day consumed me. She was sprawled across her bed like she owned the whole world, one leg outside the blankets, her mouth open in that vulnerable way kids sleep. Her dark hair was a mess across the pillow, tangled from a night of sleeping without care. She looked exactly like her mother. That was the hardest part sometimes. Seeing Elena in her face. Elena had left 4 years ago, found someone with more money, better prospects, someone who could give her the life that didn't involve rationing heat or choosing between the electric bill and groceries. I couldn't blame her for leaving. I understood why she'd done it. What I couldn't understand was how she left Sophie, how a mother could just not show up, how she could miss her daughter's first day of school and her 7th birthday and the moment when Sophie had learned to ride a bike, how a mother could be replaced in a child's life by simply choosing not to show up. I stood in the doorway for exactly 45 seconds. That was my ritual, something I'd developed in those first months after Elena left. 45 seconds to be a father without having to accomplish anything, without earning money or fixing things or figuring out how to make ends meet, without the weight of knowing that everything I did or didn't do would shape who this little girl became. 45 seconds without the constant low-level panic that was now my default state. 45 seconds just to exist in the same room and remember why I was doing all this, why I got up at 5 in the morning, why I drove a truck that barely worked into a city where I didn't belong, why I spent my days making sure wealthy people's climate control systems never failed while mine could barely keep us warm. I watched her breathe, her small chest rising and falling, her hand curled into a fist like she was holding onto something in her sleep, like she was protecting something, like she was afraid it would be taken away if she wasn't careful. As a parent, you learned that your child's peace was your responsibility. You learned that every moment of comfort they experienced was built on your willingness to sacrifice your own. You learned that love was not an emotion you felt. Love was what you did when everything in you wanted to give up. Then I closed the door and headed downstairs. The drive into Manhattan took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of thinking about money. 40 minutes of calculating. 40 minutes of worry. By the time I merged onto the expressway, the sun was coming up over Queens Boulevard, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that would have been beautiful if I'd had the mental space to appreciate them. The traffic was already heavy, angry, impatient. My truck rattled along in the right lane, burning oil, dripping something underneath that I kept meaning to check but never had time for. The radio was playing a song I didn't like, but I didn't change it because the radio had only worked sporadically for the past year and I was afraid that if I touched it, it would stop working completely. That was my life now. Everything was held together with prayers and fear and the understanding that one wrong move could make the whole thing collapse. I'd worked as an HVAC technician for 20 years. 20 years of learning the intricate systems that controlled temperature and air quality in buildings across the city. 20 years of becoming an expert in compressors and refrigerants and electrical controls. 20 years of understanding the language of thermodynamics and pressure and heat transfer. It was useful knowledge. It paid the bills, it kept the apartment warm and Sophie fed and her school tuition paid. But it also meant that I spent my days making sure other people were comfortable while I lived in constant discomfort. My first job was in Midtown, a luxury apartment building where the climate control system had failed on the 23rd floor. The building manager had called me at 5:15 that morning, which meant they had waited until the last possible second to address the problem. The penthouse occupants wanted their heat fixed before they woke up. They wanted their comfort restored without ever having to think about the process of restoration. They wanted a man like me to appear, do his work invisibly and disappear, leaving only the result. It was the nature of my work. I was infrastructure. I was invisible. He parked in a spot that was technically only for residents, knowing he might get a ticket. He didn't care about the ticket. A $20 ticket was something he could absorb. It was cheaper than paying to park in the actual parking garage, which would have eaten into his profit on this job. The math was always tight. He took the service elevator up, the one that was separated from the main elevator by a discreet door that the wealthy probably never noticed. The main elevator had mirrors and soft lighting and gentle music. The service elevator had fluorescent lights and stainless steel and the smell of industrial cleaner. Service elevators always felt different than regular elevators. They were more industrial, less polished. They had a particular smell, something like cleaning solution and the accumulation of years of people like me passing through them. The mechanical room on the 23rd floor was accessed through a locked door that he had to call the building manager to open. The manager was a guy named Robert, who had been in the position for 12 years and who treated maintenance people with a kind of neutral respect that was rare in his experience. Robert opened the door without complaining and stood aside to let Marcus inside, not hovering, not supervising, just giving him space to do his work. This was professionalism at its best, the kind that Marcus respected. The HVAC system hummed and whirred, a complex arrangement of pipes and compressors and electronic controls that Marcus understood in a way that most people couldn't. He'd spent 20 years learning these systems. He'd become an expert in the language of air and temperature and pressure. It was useful knowledge in a city that demanded climate control the way it demanded everything else. He spent 2.5 hours diagnosing the problem. The compressor was shot. It had been limping along for months, producing the kind of partial heating that the penthouse occupants had been ignoring until it failed completely. They'd waited too long, ignored the warning signs, and now they had an emergency on their hands. Marcus replaced the compressor with practiced efficiency, moving through the work without wasted motion. He tested the system twice, making sure it was working properly. Then he added another 2 hours to the bill for having to come early in the morning. This was standard practice. He charged them for parts they probably didn't need, because that was how you survived in this business. You did good work, but you also protected yourself. You added a little extra to the bill. Not so much that they would question it, but enough to cover the times when the jobs were smaller or the people were poorer and you couldn't charge as much. This was the mathematics of survival. This was how a man like Marcus kept his family afloat. He felt fine about it. He'd stopped feeling guilty about it years ago. His second job was in the upper 80s, a penthouse belonging to a woman named Margaret whose air conditioning was cycling on and off unpredictably. She had called the building's service number 3 times in the past week, which meant she was bothered enough to make a phone call but not bothered enough to address the problem when it first started. Marcus had fixed her system before, small adjustments that kept her comfortable. This time the problem was the thermostat. A simple replacement, something he could do in 20 minutes if he worked efficiently. When he finished, Margaret came into the room to check his work. She was wearing yoga clothes and had the specific kind of beauty that came from having a standing appointment with a personal trainer. She looked at him, and he could see the moment she registered him as the guy who fixed her air conditioning, the guy who kept her comfortable without her having to think about it or acknowledge his presence in any meaningful way. She looked through him the way people always did, not with malice, not with cruelty, just with the simple inability to see someone who wasn't part of their world. He watched her not see him as he left. He carried his toolbox down the service elevator and back to his truck and drove to his third job, which was scheduled for 1 p.m., but which he knew he would have to cut short to pick up Sophie from school. The third job was a restaurant in Tribeca whose freezer system had broken down. $800 worth of food was at risk of spoiling. The owner was panicking, pacing back and forth in the kitchen, looking at Marcus like he was the only person who could save him. Which was probably true. Marcus was good at what he did. He was good at understanding systems. He was good at fixing things. He was good at being the person who made other people's problems go away. He charged the owner a premium for the emergency service. He fixed the problem in 45 minutes and added another $200 to the bill for having to come on short notice. The owner paid without questioning it, which meant he wasn't as rich as he was trying to appear. But he was rich enough that $200 meant nothing to him. It was the calculation Marcus had learned to make. He left at 2:45 p.m. to pick up Sophie. School ended at 3 p.m., but the aftercare program kept children until 6 p.m. for families that needed it. Sophie was always there waiting, looking smaller than she was, patient in a way that broke his heart every single time he saw her sitting in that corner of the room, surrounded by other children whose parents had probably called from offices to say they'd be late. She was doing homework when he arrived, sitting at a small table in the corner, trying to solve math problems that seemed to confuse her. She looked up when she saw him and smiled like he had just come back from saving the world. Like his presence was the most important thing that had happened to her all day. Which, he realized, it probably was. Her teacher, Mrs. Chen, waved at him from across the room with that specific kind of sympathy that people reserved for people like him. The look that said she understood. The look that said she was sorry she probably made more money than he did, and she was sorry for him. That was how far down he had fallen. A schoolteacher felt sorry for him. Sophie climbed into the truck without complaining about how cold it was. She never complained anymore. That was the worst part of having money problems as a parent. Your child started to make themselves smaller. Started to understand, in the way that children did, that wanting things was a luxury she couldn't afford. Started to fold herself into the shape of your limitations. And there was nothing you could do to stop it because you were the one creating those limitations. On the drive back to their apartment, Sophie was quieter than usual. She stared out the window at the city passing by, at the storefronts and the people and all the visible abundance that they passed through but never inhabited. She watched people with shopping bags. She watched restaurants with warm lights spilling onto the sidewalk. She watched the world like it was a movie that she was allowed to observe but not participate in. "Are you okay?" he asked. His hands were on the wheel, his eyes on the traffic. He was doing 3 things at once, as usual. Driving, thinking about money, worrying about Sophie. "I saw something at school today," Sophie said. She was using her careful voice, the one she used when she was asking for something she knew was impossible, the one she had developed over the past 4 years to soften the impact of her own needs. Marcus felt his chest tighten. This was the part of being a single father that nobody prepared you for. The moments when your kid asked for things you couldn't give. "What did you see?" he asked, keeping his voice level, trying to sound like a father who could handle anything, who could provide anything. "A dress," Sophie said. "One of the girls in the upper grades showed us a picture on her phone during lunch. It's from a store on 5th Avenue. It's the kind of place where things are very expensive. It's blue, like the color of the sky when it's about to turn to stars. Marcus didn't respond right away. He navigated a turn, waited at a light, kept driving. The light turned green and he pressed the accelerator. He was thinking about the dress. He was thinking about how his daughter had a mother who loved colors, who had left them both behind when she decided that love wasn't enough. Eleanor had been beautiful and colorful and alive, and then she had gotten tired. Tired of being married to a man who worked with his hands. Tired of their apartment and their life and the struggle of it all. She had decided that there was someone better somewhere and she had gone looking for him. She had found him too. A man with money, a man with a career, a man with prospects. She had moved to California and sent minimal child support. Marcus hadn't heard from her in almost 2 years. Sophie hadn't heard from her either. "Can I see it?" he asked finally. Sophie pulled out a worn tablet that the school had given her for educational purposes. It had been a hand-me-down from a family that had donated it, and the screen protector was cracked, but it worked. She showed him a picture that she'd somehow saved to the tablet's memory. A cobalt blue dress with intricate embroidery along the neckline and sleeves. It had a kind of delicate quality that suggested it had been made by someone who understood that clothes could tell stories. "It's beautiful," he said. Which was true and insufficient, and the worst thing he could have said, because now Sophie was going to want it with the particular intensity that children brought to beautiful things. The kind of wanting that didn't fade. The kind of wanting that stayed with you for years. Whispering to you in the middle of the night about all the things you couldn't have. "The dress is at a store called Ashford Elegance," Sophie said, reading from her tablet. "It's in Manhattan. On 5th Avenue. The girl who showed me said her mom goes there all the time." Marcus held the steering wheel tighter. His hands were sweating. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to say anything because the numbers were already running through his head. $387 left until his next paycheck. Rent was due in 10 days. Sophie needed new shoes. The truck needed an oil change that he'd been putting off for 3 months. The dress, he was certain, cost more than any of those things. The dress probably cost more than everything. That night, after Sophie was asleep in her room and the apartment was quiet except for the sound of the radiator, Marcus pulled out his laptop. The laptop was old, something he'd bought used for $100 4 years ago. It was slow and it got hot quickly, but it worked. He searched for Ashford Elegance and waited for the website to load. The site took a full 30 seconds to appear, and when it did, it was all minimalist design and carefully curated photography. There were no people in any of the pictures, just clothes and empty space, and the subtle suggestion that if you understood quality, you didn't need anything else. This was the aesthetic of true luxury, the absence of explanation, the assumption that you either understood or you didn't belong. He navigated to the children's section and found the dress. It was there, exactly as Sophie had described it. The cobalt blue was perfect, the embroidery intricate and precise. The dress looked like something that had been made by someone who understood that clothing was not just about covering the body but about telling a story. He clicked on it and saw the price, $875. He looked at it for so long that the screensaver came up. $875. That was what he made in a week if he worked every day without a break. That was rent for 1 month. That was food for 3 months. That was his daughter's entire life in dollars. He closed the laptop without clicking anything. He had no business looking at things like that. It was like going to a restaurant and staring at the menu knowing you couldn't order anything. It was like window shopping for dreams you would never have. But Sophie's words stayed with him. The color of the sky when it's about to turn to stars. His daughter had described a dress the way poets described hope. His daughter had looked at something beautiful, and instead of just wanting it, she had translated it into something meaningful. She had made it about more than fabric and thread. That's what kids did. They found the poetry in everything. And they didn't understand yet that poetry wasn't worth anything in a world that only valued money. Marcus lay in bed that night and made himself a promise. He would find a way to get that dress. He didn't know how. He didn't know where the money would come from. But he made the promise anyway because that was what fathers did. They made impossible promises and then tried to keep them. He lay awake for most of the night, turning over possibilities in his mind. He could pick up more jobs. He could work weekends. He could ask for a raise, though his current boss had already made it clear that there was no money for raises. He could take out a loan, but he had already maxed out the 2 credit cards he had, and the banks wouldn't lend to someone with his credit score anyway. He could sell something, but he had nothing worth selling. Everything he owned had been bought with survival in mind, not resale value. By the time the sun came up, Marcus had decided. He would go into the store. He would look at the dress in person, and somehow, he would find a way to make his daughter's impossible dream come true. Part 2. The Luxury Store. On Saturday morning, 1 week later, Marcus decided to do something he had promised himself he would never do. He decided to go into the store. He made Sophie promise not to get her hopes up. He told her it was just to look, just to see the dress in person, just to understand what she was seeing in the picture. Sophie had nodded solemnly, as if she understood the distinction between looking and wanting, even though Marcus knew she didn't. Even though he was sure that looking at something beautiful would only increase the wanting. He drove into Manhattan and parked illegally 3 blocks away because parking near Fifth Avenue cost money he didn't have. They walked the distance in the cold, Sophie's hand in his, her breath making small clouds in the November air. His hand was freezing, but he didn't put it in his pocket because Sophie needed him to be warm. Sophie needed him to be strong, or at least she needed him to seem strong, which was the same thing in the end. The store was intimidating in the way that luxury always is. The facade was made of glass and steel, all clean lines and expensive emptiness. The interior was all marble and carefully placed light, the kind of light that made everything look better than it was. There were no visible price tags anywhere, which Marcus understood meant the prices were somewhere north of what normal people made in a month. This was intentional. Prices that weren't displayed were prices that didn't matter to the people who shopped here. Sophie's eyes went wide when she saw it. She wasn't thinking about money yet, just about beauty. She wasn't thinking about the impossibility of it. She was just experiencing the beauty, which was all children could do. He held onto her hand and pushed open the door. The air inside was different, cooler, cleaner, infused with something that smelled like money felt. It smelled like expensive perfume mixed with the particular quietness of a place where nothing cheap had ever been. Marcus had been inside plenty of wealthy people's homes doing HVAC work, so he understood the aesthetic. He just didn't usually have to move through it as a customer. He didn't usually have to navigate it while trying to pretend he belonged. A woman appeared almost immediately, approaching them with a smile that was professionally perfect and personally empty. Her name tag said Brianna. She was tall and blonde and had the specific kind of beauty that came from having money to maintain it. She had probably never worried about affording a haircut or a manicure. She had probably never looked at the prices of things before buying them. She looked at Marcus's worn jacket, at his work boots that had seen actual work, at his daughter's school hand-me-downs that had come from the second-hand bin, and the equation solved itself in her expression. This family didn't belong here. This family couldn't afford anything in this store. But she would be polite about it because that's what professionalism meant in a place like this. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, speaking to Sophie but meaning something else entirely. She was already moving toward them, already prepared to guide them toward whatever cheap version of beauty they could actually access. "The blue dress," Sophie said quietly, pointing toward the display window where it hung on a mannequin that looked like it had never been uncomfortable in its life. The mannequin was perfectly formed, perfectly positioned. It existed in a state of permanent grace. Brianna's eyes shifted. "That's our Sophia collection," she explained, and Marcus could hear the shift in her voice, the way it became more careful now. "It's really quite exclusive. Each piece is handcrafted in Milan." She paused for effect, letting the weight of those words settle in the air between them. Very exclusive, limited edition. For a select clientele. Marcus understood what she meant. Exclusive meant not for people like him. Exclusive meant that his daughter's want was classified, filed away in a category labeled impossible. Exclusive meant luxury for people who didn't have to think about money, who could afford to be exclusive. "May I check the price?" he asked, walking toward the dress. He didn't ask permission of Brianna. He asked the universe in the form of a question, knowing the universe wouldn't answer but hoping anyway. Hope was all he had left sometimes. The tag read $875. Sophie saw it. He watched his daughter see the price and then watch her expression change. Watched her understand that wanting something didn't make it available. Watched her learn another lesson about the architecture of the world. Watched her fold herself smaller once again. It happened in real time. He could see the exact moment when hope died in his daughter's eyes and was replaced by acceptance of reality. It was one of the worst moments of his life. "We have some items in the clearance section," Brianna offered, and her voice was now trying to sound helpful in a way that was actually a kind of violence. "Much more reasonably priced. The quality isn't quite the same, but they're very cute for children's birthday parties." She said it like birthday parties were a kind of pity event, something that children did because they didn't know any better. Marcus heard it. He felt the sting of it, the implication that his daughter belonged in clearance, the suggestion that she should be grateful for anything less than perfect. But he didn't respond to it because responding meant it had landed, and he had learned a long time ago not to let people like Brianna know that their comments had weight. Instead, he walked toward the white marble bench in the window and sat down with Sophie. He pulled her against him and asked her about her day. He asked her about Mrs. Chen and Tommy, who had knocked over the paint cups in art class, and the library book about dragons that she was reading. He asked her to tell him everything that mattered. He asked her to pretend for a moment that they were the only two people in the room. Sophie told him because that was what she did. She talked to him like he was actually listening, like what she said mattered, the way she had learned to do from the very beginning. And for a few minutes, the expensive store with its expensive things and its quiet judgment faded into the background. For a few minutes, they were just two people in a room together. A father and daughter, a man and his child, the only things that actually mattered in the world. That was when Marcus noticed the woman. She was standing in the back of the store, partially visible through the glass partition of what looked like an office. She wasn't watching the store in the way that security would watch. She was watching them. Watching his daughter talk. Watching his hand shake slightly as he held Sophie's shoulder. Watching the price tag still clutched in his left hand. He watched her watching him for exactly 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, something passed between them. Not words, not communication in any formal sense, but understanding, recognition. The sense that she had seen something that no one else in that store could see. The sense that she understood something about him that went beyond the worn jacket and the work boots and the fact that he was in a place where he didn't belong. Then she did something unexpected. She turned and disappeared into the office. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. He didn't know what it meant. He just knew that something had changed. Something in the way that woman had looked at them had suggested that she understood something. That she had seen something in them that went beyond their poverty or their worn clothes or the fact that they didn't belong. They left the store 5 minutes later without buying anything. Sophie didn't ask why they had come if they weren't going to buy the dress. She understood the adult world well enough to know that sometimes you just went to look at things you couldn't have. Sometimes you just acknowledged that beautiful things existed and that you weren't the kind of person who got to have them. In the truck driving home, Sophie asked if the lady in the store had been nice. "Which lady?" Marcus asked, though he knew exactly which one she meant. The one in the back, the one who was looking at us. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I think she was." He didn't sleep well that night. He kept thinking about the woman, kept replaying the moment she had watched them, kept wondering what she had seen in that interaction that made her look the way she had. Like she recognized something, like she understood something. Part 3. The Mysterious Woman. On Sunday morning, when Sophie was at school in the aftercare program because Marcus had picked up an extra job, he received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. "Hello," a woman's voice said. "Is this Marcus Webb?" His stomach dropped immediately. He thought of Sophie, of emergencies, of all the terrible things that phone calls from strangers could mean. This is he. Is something wrong? "No," the woman said. "I don't think anything is wrong. I was the woman in the back of the store. My name is Victoria Saint." Marcus remembered her then, the way she had watched them, the way something in her expression had cracked open for just a second. "I remember you," he said. Victoria paused on the other end of the line. "Good," she said. "I'd like to meet with you and your daughter. There's something I want to discuss. Can you come to a coffee shop tomorrow morning? There's one near your apartment building. I know where you live because your information was in our customer inquiry system from when you visited the store." "How do you know where I live?" Marcus asked, his voice changing. "Becoming careful." "Your information was in our customer inquiry system," Victoria said smoothly. "I'm sorry. I realize that sounds like I'm being intrusive." "I'm not. I promise. I just wanted to see you again, to talk. Would you be willing to do that?" Marcus should have said no. He should have hung up. He should have protected himself and his daughter from the kind of complications that involved mysterious women from luxury stores calling him on his personal phone. He should have been more suspicious. He should have been more careful. Instead, he found himself saying yes. They met on Monday morning at a small coffee shop 3 blocks from his apartment. Sophie was holding his hand, uncertain about why they were meeting a woman from the fancy store. Victoria was wearing casual clothes, which was somehow more intimidating than the professional outfit she had worn at the store. She looked real, vulnerable, like a person instead of a representative of something exclusive. She ordered coffee and sat across from them at a small table. She looked at Sophie first, not Marcus, which was a deliberate choice that established a different kind of relationship than Marcus had expected. "What's your name?" she asked. "Sophie," Sophie said carefully. "That's a beautiful name," Victoria said. "I'm Victoria. I want to tell you something about your father. Can I do that?" Sophie looked at Marcus. He nodded. She turned back to Victoria and said, "Okay." Victoria took a breath, like she was choosing her words carefully. Like this conversation mattered to her in a way that she was trying to control. "Years ago, my brother was homeless," Victoria said. "He lost his job and his girlfriend left him and his family was complicated and he ended up sleeping in parking garages because he had nowhere else to go. He was very sad and very alone. And then a stranger gave him a jacket, just a jacket, and some food, and told him that he believed my brother could rebuild his life." Victoria paused. "That stranger was your father." Marcus felt the blood in his face drain. He looked at Sophie and saw her eyes widen. Sophie looked at her father like she was seeing him for the first time, like she was reassessing everything she knew about who he was and what he was capable of. "How do you know that?" Marcus asked. His voice was very quiet. "Because my brother told me," Victoria said. "He told me the story so many times that I memorized every word. He said this man was quiet and kind and that he never asked for anything in return. He just helped. My brother's name is James. He's 38 years old now. He's the founder and owner of Ashford & Associates. He built a luxury brand from nothing because that stranger believed he could do it." Marcus couldn't speak. The memory was coming back to him in pieces. Years ago when he was working construction in the city and Elena was still just a girlfriend, not yet a wife. There had been a kid, maybe 23, sleeping in the garage of a building he was renovating. The kid had looked like he was disappearing, literally wasting away. Marcus had given him his jacket and some money and a number for a job site that was hiring. He'd never thought about what happened to the kid after that. He'd done it because the kid needed help, not because he expected anything in return. He'd done it and moved on with his life. He'd given away a jacket that he needed. But the kid had needed it more. My brother never forgot you, Victoria continued. And I've been looking for you for 7 years because I want to tell you something. When I saw you in my store on Saturday, I recognized my brother in the way you carried yourself, the way you loved your daughter, the way you refused to apologize for needing something. I saw someone who understands that good people don't stop being good just because the world doesn't reward them. Marcus didn't know what to say. He felt Sophie's hand tighten in his. What I want to do, Victoria said, is pass forward the kindness that saved my brother. Your daughter saw a dress that she loves, and I want her to have it. Not as charity, as a thank you, as a way of making sure that kindness doesn't stop. Marcus should have said no immediately. He should have explained that he didn't accept handouts, that he didn't want to be indebted to anyone, that he had survived this long on his own strength and his own work, that accepting help would make him feel like a failure, that he was supposed to be the one providing, not receiving. But Sophie squeezed his hand, and Victoria was looking at him with an expression that suggested she understood something about him that nobody else had bothered to see. Let me think about it, he said finally. That's all I asked, Victoria said. The conversation shifted after that. Victoria asked about Sophie's school, about Marcus's work, about the life they had built together in Queens. She asked real questions and listened to the answers. By the time they left the coffee shop, Sophie was comfortable with Victoria in a way that made Marcus both grateful and terrified. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Marcus pulled up James's social media profile. The photos showed a man who looked like he had stepped out of an advertisement, clean, confident, successful. But there was something in his eyes in some of the photos that Marcus recognized. The look of someone who had been saved by kindness and spent his life remembering. The look of someone who understood that his entire existence was a gift given to him by a stranger. The next day, Victoria called again. She had a proposal. I can't buy you the dress outright, she said, because I know you wouldn't accept that. But what I can do is commission a custom piece, not from my store. From a designer that my brother knows, a designer who creates clothes as art. The dress will be completely unique. It will reflect your daughter's story, not just copy what you saw in the window. What would this cost? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. It won't cost you anything, Victoria said. Let me do this. Marcus felt something in his chest that was dangerous. It felt like hope. It felt like someone seeing him, really seeing him for the first time in years. It felt like the beginning of something that could either save him or destroy him. Okay, he said. But then Elena called. His ex-wife's voice came through the phone in a way that made Marcus go still. He was at work, in between jobs, sitting in his truck and eating a sandwich he'd made from bread and peanut butter, when his phone buzzed. He almost didn't answer. He almost let it go to voicemail. But he had trained himself to answer calls because you never knew when it might be something important. She had a new partner, she explained. A man with money and stability. She wanted custody of Sophie. Not forever, just during the holidays. She wanted to give Sophie an experience of what a real family could provide. She said it with the kind of casual cruelty that came from someone who had already made up her mind and was just informing him of the decision. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. A real family. As if what he had built with Sophie over the past 8 years wasn't real. As if his love wasn't enough. As if money was what made a family real. As if 8 years of showing up every single day, of being the person Sophie could count on, of sacrificing his own comfort and his own future for her well-being, was somehow less real than a relationship built on financial stability. Marcus felt something break in him. The past 8 years of building stability, of showing up, of loving his daughter despite the exhaustion and the fear, all of it suddenly felt fragile. Elena had left because he wasn't successful enough, and now success was coming to get his daughter from him. He told Victoria that night. He didn't want to. He didn't want to admit that the world he had built could be taken away. But Victoria had become someone he could tell things to. You're going to fight it, she said. It wasn't a question. I can't afford a lawyer, Marcus said. I can barely afford to live. Then let me help you, Victoria said. No, he said, and the force of it surprised them both. I won't be indebted to you like that. This is my problem. I have to solve it. But you can't, Victoria said, and that's the part you're refusing to accept. You can't do everything alone. Nobody can. That's not strength. That's just suffering. They argued. It was the first real conflict between them, and it hurt more than Marcus expected it to. He said things about independence and self-reliance. Victoria said things about fear masquerading as dignity. By the end of it, they weren't talking to each other. Sophie asked why they were fighting. Because your father is scared, Victoria said, and she was looking at Marcus when she said it. He's scared that if he accepts help, he'll lose control. He's scared that you'll think less of him if he admits he needs something. But what he doesn't understand is that needing things doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Marcus wanted to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Why are you scared of being seen? Sophie asked him that night. Her 8-year-old daughter had asked him a question that therapists couldn't have been more precise about, and Marcus had finally broken. He had told Sophie about what it felt like to be invisible, about working in buildings where rich people never saw him, about being a father who was trying so hard not to fail that he'd forgotten how to receive, about the terror of being known because being known meant being disappointed. Sophie had held his hand while he cried, which was not the order things were supposed to go in. Final section. The next morning, Marcus called Victoria. Okay, he said, help me with the lawyer. And she did. The lawyer was the best that money could hire. She was a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in custody cases and had a particular fury about absent parents trying to re-establish custody for convenience. She reviewed the case file and made 3 phone calls, and by the end of the week it was clear that Elena had no legal standing. She hadn't been involved in Sophie's life for 4 years. She had no stable housing with the new partner. She was working in a different state. The judge dismissed the case without needing trial. Marcus had won. Sophie was his. The fear that he had carried for so long was suddenly gone, and the dress arrived. It came in a box that was almost too beautiful to open. Inside was the cobalt blue dress, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. It was a perfect copy of the original that Sophie had seen in Ashford Elegance, but it was also completely unique. The silver threading caught the light in patterns that looked like stars, and water and grief transformed into something beautiful. And in the hem, if you looked very carefully, you could see the tiny thread and needles from Sophie's mother's sewing kit, worked so skillfully into the design that they looked like they had always been part of the dress. Sophie tried it on in the bathroom of their apartment. When she came out, Marcus saw his daughter transformed. She wasn't a child from a single-parent household anymore. She was a girl wearing a dress that told the story of her mother's love and her father's sacrifice and a stranger's kindness. She was seen, really seen. That's when everything changed. Marcus asked Victoria to come over. When she arrived, Sophie ran to her and hugged her without hesitation. Victoria held Sophie and looked at Marcus, and something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, a commitment, a future. I'm sorry, Marcus said, for being stubborn, for being afraid. You're not sorry, Victoria said, and she was smiling. You're grateful. And you're learning that being grateful doesn't erase who you are. They had dinner together that night, the 3 of them in Marcus's small apartment. It was pasta and sauce from a jar and vegetables that were slightly past their prime, but nobody cared. They were together. They were seen. They mattered. Later, after Sophie was asleep, Victoria and Marcus sat on the fire escape outside the window. The city spread out below them in lights and possibility. Victoria told him about her plan to transform Ashford Elegance from a luxury store into something different, a place that celebrated work and resilience, a place that hired people from communities that usually weren't visible in that kind of space. That sounds like you, Marcus said. That sounds like us, Victoria corrected, because I don't think I would have thought of any of this without you. Marcus took her hand. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to be held. 3 months later, school had a holiday celebration. Marcus was asked by the principal if he would volunteer to help design and install a new climate control system for the school's expansion. It was a pro bono project using his expertise to improve something for children like his daughter. He said yes immediately. Victoria volunteered to help with fundraising. They built it together. Not just the HVAC system, but something more. A partnership, a future. On the day of the school's appreciation event, Sophie was in the holiday play. She wore the blue dress underneath her costume. When the lights came up, she was brilliant, confident, free. Marcus watched from the audience and felt something in his chest that was almost too large to contain. After the play, Elena appeared. She was with her new partner, and she looked at Sophie with an expression that was almost regretful. She approached Marcus and said, "She's happy. She's really happy. Thank you for that." Sophie was always going to be happy, Marcus said. I just needed people to help me believe that was possible. It was a moment of grace. Elena asked if she could be more involved in Sophie's life, not as a custody threat, but as Sophie's mother who wanted to know her better. Marcus said yes, because he had learned that expansion was possible, that healing was possible, that people could change. That night, Victoria and Marcus sat on a bench in Central Park, watching the city lights. They hadn't explicitly defined what their relationship was. It existed in that space between something and everything, romantic without being assumed, intimate without being required. I've been thinking about something, Victoria said. What if Ashford Elegance became more than just a luxury store? What do you mean? Marcus asked. What if we used the store as a platform, featuring designers who create pieces that celebrate resilience and work and labor and dignity, hiring people from underserved communities, creating something that sees people instead of prices? That sounds like you, Marcus said. That sounds like us, Victoria said, because I don't think I would have thought of this without you. Sophie had decided she wanted to design clothes. She'd been sketching constantly since she wore the dress, inspired by what Michael had created. Marcus recognized the passion and enrolled her in a Saturday design class. Victoria helped connect her with a mentor, a young designer who worked for James. A month later, Sophie was in the class, surrounded by other children from different backgrounds, all creating something beautiful, all being seen by the teacher, all mattering. Marcus and Victoria stood outside the design studio, watching through the glass. They didn't talk because there was nothing left to prove. The greatest luxury is being seen by someone who chooses to stay. That was what Marcus understood as he watched his daughter designing, as he felt Victoria's hand slide into his, as he realized that the invisible man had finally become visible. Victoria's brother James sent Marcus a personal invitation to meet him. When they finally sat down together in James's office overlooking the city, James had tears in his eyes. He told Marcus that the jacket had been more than fabric. It had been proof that someone believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. Sophie became an apprentice designer at Ashford & Associates before she was even 12 years old, working with Michael on custom pieces that told people's stories through fabric. The store transformed into something revolutionary, a place where beautiful things were created by people with beautiful hearts, where the invisible were made visible, where a single act of kindness rippled outward through time and changed everything. Marcus eventually left his HVAC work and became Victoria's partner in the business, designing systems that used cutting-edge technology to serve communities that had previously been ignored. Together, they built something that mattered. The dress still hung in Sophie's closet. She didn't wear it every day, but she wore it sometimes, and when she did, she wore it like a story, like a promise, like proof that even in a city full of invisible people, someone was paying attention. If you've ever felt unseen, underestimated, or struggling, please subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Thank you for watching.